Origins of the Family, Private Property and the State by Friedrich Engels. Chapter 1. Stages of Prehistoric Culture. Morgan is the first man who, with expert knowledge, has attempted to introduce a definite order into the history of primitive man. So long as no important additional material makes changes necessary, his classification will undoubtedly remain in force. Of the three main epochs, savagery, barbarism, and civilization, he is concerned, of course, only with the first two, and the transition to the third. He divides both savagery and barbarism into lower, middle, and upper stages, according to the progress made in production of food. For he says, quote, "Upon their skill in this direction, the whole question of human supremacy on the earth depended. Mankind are the only beings who may be said to have gained an absolute control over the production of food. It is accordingly probable that the great epochs of human progress have been identified more or less directly with the enlargement of the sources of subsistence." End quote. The development of the family takes a parallel course, but here the periods have not such striking marks of differentiation. Section 1. Savagery. A. Lower stage. Childhood of the human race. Man still lived in his original habitat, in tropical or subtropical forests, and was partially at least a tree dweller, for otherwise his survival among huge beasts of prey cannot be explained. Fruit, nuts, and roots served them for food. The development of articulate speech is the main result of this period. Of all the peoples known to history, none was still at this primitive level. Though this period may have lasted thousands of years, we have no direct evidence to prove its existence. But once the evolution of man from the animal kingdom is admitted, such a transitional stage must necessarily be assumed. B. The middle stage. This begins with the utilization of fish for food, including crabs, mussels, and other aquatic animals, and with the use of fire. The two are complementary, since fish becomes edible only by the use of fire. With this new source of nourishment, men now became independent of climate and locality. Even as savages, they could, by following the rivers and coasts, spread over most of the earth. Proof of these migrations is the distribution over every continent of the crudely worked, unsharpened flint tools of the earlier Stone Age, known as paleoliths, all or most of which date from this period. New environments, ceaseless exercise of his inventive faculty, and the ability to produce fire by friction led man to discover new kinds of food. Farinaceous roots and tubers, for instance, were baked in hot ashes or in ground ovens. With the invention of the first weapons, clubs and spears, game could sometimes be added to the fare. But the tribes which figure in books as living entirely, that is, exclusively, by hunting, never existed in reality. The yield of the hunt was far too precarious. At this stage, owing to the continual uncertainty of food supplies, cannibalism seems to have arisen, and was practiced from now onwards for a long time. The Australian Aborigines and many Polynesians are still in the middle stage of savagery today. C. The upper stage. This begins with the invention of the bow and arrow, whereby game became a regular source of food and hunting a normal form of work. Bow, string, and arrow already constitute a very complex instrument, whose invention implies long accumulated experience and sharpened intelligence, and therefore knowledge of many other inventions as well. We find, in fact, that the peoples acquainted with the bow and arrow, but not yet with pottery, from which Morgan dates the transition to barbarism, are already making some beginnings towards settlement in villages, and have gained some control over the production of the means of subsistence. We find wooden vessels and utensils, finger weaving without looms, with filaments of bark, plated baskets of bast or osier, sharpened Neolithic stone tools. With the discovery of fire and the stone axe, dugout canoes now become common. Beams and planks are also sometimes used for building houses. We find all these advances, for instance, among the Indians of Northwest America, who are acquainted with the bow and arrow, but not with pottery. The bow and arrow was for savagery, what the iron sword was for barbarism, and firearms for civilization, the decisive weapon. Section 2. Barbarism. A. Lower stage. Dates from the introduction of pottery. In many cases, it has been proved, and in all, it is probable, that the first pots originated from the habit of covering baskets or wooden vessels with clay to make them fireproof. In this way, it was soon discovered that the clay mold answered the purpose without any inner vessel. Thus far, we've been able to follow the general line of development applicable to all peoples at a given period without distinction of place. With the beginning of barbarism, however, we have reached a stage when the difference in the natural endowments of the two hemispheres of the earth comes into play. The characteristic features of the period of barbarism is the domestication and breeding of animals and the cultivation of plants. Now, the Eastern Hemisphere, the so-called Old World, possessed nearly all the animals adaptable to domestication, and all the varieties of cultivable cereals except one. The Western Hemisphere, America, had no mammals that could be domesticated, except the llama, which, moreover, was only found in one part of South America, and all of the cultivable cereals only one, though the best, namely maize. Owing to these differences in natural conditions, the population of each hemisphere now goes on its own way, and different landmarks divide the particular stages in each of the two cases. B. Middle stage. Begins in the eastern hemisphere with the domestication of animals, in the western with the cultivation by means of irrigation of plants for food, and with the use of adobe, sun-dried bricks, and stones for building. We will begin with the Western Hemisphere, as here this stage was never superseded before the European conquest. At the time when they were discovered, the Indians at the lower stage of barbarism, comprising all the tribes living east of the Mississippi, were already practicing some horticulture of maize, and possibly also of gourds, melons, and other garden plants, from which they obtained a very considerable part of their food. They lived in wooden houses in villages protected by palisades. The tribes in the northwest, particularly those in the region of the Columbia River, were still at the upper stage of savagery and acquainted neither with pottery nor with any form of horticulture. The so-called Pueblo Indians of New Mexico, however, and the Mexicans, Central Americans, and Peruvians at the time of their conquest were at the middle stage of barbarism. They lived in houses like fortresses, made of adobe brick or of stone, and cultivated maize and other plants, varying according to locality and climate, in artificially irrigated plots of ground which supplied their main sources of food. Some animals even had also been domesticated, the turkey and other birds by the Mexicans, the llama by the Peruvians. They could also work metals, but not iron. Hence, they were still unable to dispense with stone weapons and tools. The Spanish conquest then cut short any further independent development. In the Eastern Hemisphere, the middle stage of barbarism began with the domestication of animals providing milk and meat, but horticulture seems to have remained unknown far into this period. It was, apparently, the domestication and breeding of animals and the formation of herds of considerable size that led to the differentiation of Aryans and Semites from the mass of barbarians. The Europeans and Asiatic Aryans still have the same names for cattle, but those for most cultivated plants are already different. In suitable localities, the keeping of herds led to a pastoral life. The Semites lived upon grassy plains of the Euphrates and Tigris, and the Aryans upon those of India and those of the Oxus and Jahartis, of the Don and the Dnieper. It must have been on the borders of such pasture lands that animals were first domesticated. To later generations, consequently, the pastoral tribes appear to have come from regions which, so far from being the cradle of mankind, were almost uninhabitable for their savage ancestors and for man at the lower stage of barbarism. But having once accustomed themselves to pastoral lives in the grassy plains of the rivers, these barbarians of the middle period would never have dreamed of returning willingly to the native forests of their ancestors. Even when they were forced further to the north and west, the Semites and Aryans could not move into foreign regions of Western Asia and Europe until, by cultivation of grain, they had made it possible to pasture and especially to winter their herds on this less favorable land. It is more than probable that among these tribes the cultivation of grain originated from the need for cattle fodder and only later became important as a human food supply. The plentiful supply of milk and meat, and especially the beneficial effect of these foods on the growth of the children, account perhaps for the superior development of the Aryans and Semitic races. It is a fact that the Pueblo Indians of New Mexico, who are reduced to an almost entirely vegetarian diet, have smaller brains than the Indians at the lower stage of barbarism, who eat more meat and fish. In any case, cannibalism now gradually dies out, surviving only as a religious act or as a means of working magic, which here is almost the same thing. C. Upper stage. This begins with the smelting of iron ore and passes into civilization with the invention of alphabetic writing and its use for literary records. This stage, as we have seen, only the Eastern Hemisphere passed through it independently, is richer in advances in production than all the preceding stages together. To it belongs the Greeks of the heroic age, the tribes of Italy shortly before the foundation of Rome, the Germans of Tacitus, and the Northmen of the Viking age. Above all, we now meet the iron plowshare drawn by cattle, which made large scale agriculture, the cultivation of fields, possible, and thus created a practically unrestricted food supply in comparison with previous conditions. This led to the clearance of forest land for tillage and pasture, which in turn was impossible on a large scale without the iron axe and the iron spade. Population rapidly increased in number, and in small areas became dense. Prior to field agriculture, conditions must have been very exceptional if they allowed 500,000 people to be united under a central organization. Probably such a thing never occurred. We find the upper stage of barbarism at its highest in the Homeric poems, particularly the Iliad. Fully developed iron tools, the bellows, the handmill, the potter's wheel, the making of oil and wine, metalwork developing almost into a fine art, the wagon, the war chariot, shipbuilding with beams and planks, the beginnings of architecture as art, walled cities with towers and battlements, the Homeric epic, and a complete mythology. These are the chief legacy brought by the Greeks from barbarism into civilization. When we compare the descriptions which Caesar and even Tacitus gave of the Germans, who stood at the beginning of the cultural stage from which Homeric Greeks were just preparing to make the next advance, we realize how rich was the development of production within the upper stage of barbarism. The sketch which I have given here, following Morgan, of the development of mankind through savagery and barbarism to the beginnings of civilization, is already rich enough in new features. What is more, they cannot be disputed, since they are drawn directly from the process of production. Yet my sketch will seem flat and feeble compared with the picture to be unrolled at the end of our travels. Only then will the transition from barbarism to civilization stand out in full light and in all its striking contrasts. For the time being, Morgan's divisions may be summarized thus: savagery, the period in which man's appropriation of products in their natural state predominates. The products of human art are chiefly instruments which assist this appropriation. Barbarism, the period during which man learns to breed domestic animals and to practice agriculture and acquires methods of increasing the supply of natural products by human activity. Civilization, the period in which man learns a more advanced application of work to the products of nature, the period of industry proper and of art.